Hello, everyone. It is Jennie and Laurie again of Astropath. We are here today to talk about Gemini season 2025. The sun enters Gemini on May 20th at, let's see, at 2:54 p.m. That's Eastern time, and remains in Gemini until June 20th at 10:42 p.m. Eastern time. So that's Gemini season, and here we are plowing into it. Gemini is the mutable air sign. So it is the last of the three signs that make up springtime.
Mhm. Lovely.
Yeah, lovely. It's like the frantic part of spring, right?
Yeah.
Taurus is the calm, quiet. We see the beautiful flowers just coming up, and then Gemini starts and everything is in quick profusion.
Yeah.
And that's the energy of Gemini, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Gemini's a sign that's very concerned with communication and networking. And actually, one of my favorite images for Gemini, which I think is appropriate if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, is that of the honeybee gathering nectar. It really has that energy of just moving around, flying from one flower to the next, and it's gathering and it's collecting. And then it's actually dropping those off at all the different flowers. So it really imbues you with the idea of the taking in of information and data and then the delivering of it.
Mhm.
And it's often a very talkative sign, right, Laurie? Like we always kind of joke about like when you have a very Gemini person in a consultation, it can often be they may talk a lot. We'll just put it that way. And which brings us actually to the other half of Gemini is listening,
Mhm.
because you can't gather information unless you're willing to pause and listen and take stuff in. So I think our society really focuses the talking part of it, and you can also take on board the fact that it's time to listen to folks as well. So I like that about it.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it does come at the end of springtime here, and it's kind of that time of year where you're like, oh, summer is coming here quickly, and you better hurry up and figure out those last plans and talk to the people over here and figure out this plan and move all these bits of information forwards. And I always think that Gemini does kind of bring that a little bit of that franticness with it. And I would say if you live in the southern hemisphere, is the franticness of getting ready for winter
Yeah.
and get everything put away and
Yeah.
closed up. So either way, you're in.
Yeah. When I think about Gemini, I always remember something Stephen Forrest wrote in The Inner Sky, where he talks about the explosion of a puzzle factory and a set of twins running around gathering up all the little bits. And it really is, Gemini is about gathering bits of information. And I always think that the communication piece comes in because anyone with a strong Gemini component understands pretty early on that everybody they meet has a lot of information tucked away in their brains, has had all the experiences and developed all kinds of information and ideas. And so Gemini does have that ability to pull out that information. And like you said, the listening piece is the piece that Gemini sometimes needs to be reminded of. They're not going to really get that information from another person without pausing long enough to
Yeah,
listen. Yeah.
yeah. And I know that one of our most favorite concepts, both of us for Gemini, is curiosity.
Yeah.
And, at first you're just kind of like, yeah, curiosity, that's cool. But curiosity is amazing. Curiosity is something that can really lift you up. It can pull you out of some pretty intense mood states and just have you be interested in
Mhm.
what's going on around you. And it is an invaluable skill. And it kind of leads to the idea, like Gemini, I think, does get a little bit of a bad rap for being kind of like shallow or superficial or gossipy maybe, and it certainly can be that. But the truth is of Gemini is it's actually kind of unfettered. So it can go into some pretty deep study without getting attached, like without getting emotionally attached. Like Scorpio can go into deep places, but it tends to get snagged and attached on emotional parts of it.
Mhm.
Whereas Gemini doesn't bother with that, so it can swoop in and really go to some deep levels of gathering information.
Mhm.
So I do like that about it. It's a good reminder because people do kind of say, oh yeah, Gemini's that sign people like tend to they say they don't like, or it's too chatty, or and whatever. But signs always have those stereotypes, and really, there's a spectrum of expression that's allowed for each and every sign. And there's a,
Right.
the darker side of Gemini is that super, shallow, just let's talk shit about somebody at the water cooler, but then all the way to this very knowledgeable
Hmm.
sign that is really responsible for delivering information from one generation to the next.
Yeah.
So it has a pretty profound
Yeah.
function as well.
Yeah, and the whole idea of curiosity, I like that you brought up, people don't really think fully about the importance of curiosity. And I remember, I believe it was Elizabeth Gilbert talked about, people are always thinking about what's my purpose? What's my purpose? And people who don't have a purpose feel guilty because they don't know what their purpose is. And her whole thing is forget about purpose, follow your curiosity,
Hmm.
because curiosity is what will bring you to what's important. So
Mm-hmm.
if you feel kind of lost and you don't know the direction you're supposed to be going, or you don't have a definite purpose or direction that you know you need to go in, the key is to find what catches your curiosity and follow that line because it will always bring you to something that's certainly interesting and will enrich your lives.
That's a great way
Yeah.
to think about it. It's really important. Um, the other thing that occurred to me, just as a reminder, the zodiac is a wheel. So Gemini comes in after Taurus. It is a response to Taurus. So Taurus is fixed, Earth. It wants to stay the same, and Gemini wants nothing to do with that. Gemini comes in to stir the energy up and just kicks up a whole bunch of energy and just says, "All right, we're done with that. Let's move on." And that's how the wheel moves forwards. And so it's an extroverted sign. It's probably the quickest sign, and it is ruled by Mercury. So you can really think about those mercurial components, or Mercury as the messenger, as Mercury with those wings on their feet, like flying around, and it is ruled by that. So
And speaking of such, this particular Gemini season, Mercury is moving so fast that that whole idea of curiosity and quick gathering of information and quick movement is going to be really highlighted, particularly at the beginning of this
mhm.
process of Gemini season.
Yeah. Well, do you want to dive in and talk about the chart of the season
Yeah,
and talk about
let's
these
do that.
things that you're bringing up here? Okay. And Laurie and I are a little topsy-turvy in this chart, but I think it suits the season in a certain way. And we're in a field of lavender, which you can imagine is all kinds of honeybees flying around in there gathering their nectar. So anyway, that aside, this is the chart of the moment that the sun enters Gemini. And this is an Eastern time chart, so don't worry too much about what the ascendant might be or whatever. But this is what the picture is. And in essence, just as Laurie mentioned, Mercury is moving very, very quickly during this whole season. In fact, it's so quick that it starts out in Taurus, it quickly moves into Gemini, and then just about 2 weeks later, not even 2 weeks later, it goes into Cancer.
Mm.
So Mercury is the ruling sign, and there it is moving very, very quickly.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the first part, and true to form. I mean, the whole first part of the season is very high energy. There's a lot of really positive aspects. There's a lot of just things like moving in quickly. There's a lot of heat. There's fire and there's air, and it's really like cooking along. And so that the whole beginning just feels like this massive influx of energy coming from different directions, coming from your community, coming from external sources, the world around you. There's a lot moving and shaking. There's a lot of, making of plans and moving things forwards and having different conversations. And that's kind of the first part. Um, what do you have to add to that, Lori?
Well, I think, some of the things that are really activated here as the season begins, there's a bunch of things we could point to. We can think about, some of the aspects that are, yeah,
Yeah.
activated. That trine between Mars and Venus is really fiery. There's a real fiery component to that, a
Hmm.
lot of energy to direct and move our relationships forward, all of those kind of things. What other aspects jump out at you? Ooh, I
Well, I mean, that one's right in the beginning. And then there's also just like as the sun moves, it trines
ah,
Pluto. So I was like, get up. uh, double annotating.
yes, double annotating.
Well, so that's also that kind of really packs a punch right when the season starts. I mean, you don't just have this Gemini were talking about moving quickly, you have this depth and this power that comes with it when you have that trine to Pluto. So I think that's pretty early on. And then on top of that, it's also in a sextile with Neptune, which is also making this triangle with Pluto. So this is a lot of what we're talking about, where there's just this real high energy going on. And Mercury will join the Sun pretty early on as well and make those same aspects. So you have this very dynamic flow of from Pluto, the powerhouse, and then from Neptune, which is pretty newly in Aries. And Aries is the most energized or energetic sign in the whole zodiac. It really has that ignition. So that's kind of what we're talking about with this all this kind of energy flowing around. So yeah, that keeps going in the first part.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then what else do we have? We've got a square there between Jupiter and Saturn, which is going to be super important as the season moves along. Let's
Mm-hmm.
double annotate that. There you go. So that's going to be super important because both of those, one of the most important things that's happening during this season is there are so many planets changing sign over this 30-day period. We've got, like you said, Mercury's changing sign twice this month. We've got everybody's changing sign, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars. Mars finally getting out of Leo. There's just an awfully lot of changing dynamics that we want to really pay attention to.
Yeah, there's in fact there's six.
Yeah,
I mean, there's six big change. Two of them are major planets. I mean,
right.
both Saturn going into Aries and then Jupiter going into Cancer. I mean,
Right.
those are those
So,
are
yeah, and
big.
both of those planets moving into cardinal signs where rather than just kind of floating along through mutable signs, being adaptable and just, letting things go along, they're moving into cardinal signs where they are required to take action and make real things happen. So
Hmm.
that's going to be a huge piece of what's going on this
Yeah.
season.
And we'll get into the week by week in just a moment, but what you can essentially think of is the whole first part of the season, roughly until about, I would say about June 6th. You have a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy being stirred up. There's dynamic movement in the planets. But then once June 6th happens, you have Venus moving into Taurus, which I really read as the beginning of a slowdown. And then quickly after that, you have Mercury going into Cancer. And then there's a whole bunch of squares. There's a whole bunch of pretty challenging squares between planets, mostly on June 9th. So I kind of see that as having all this energy, and then wham, we kind of bump into something where there's more boundaries needed, there's more structure needed. You might feel as if you've hit some sort of wall during that time period. And then not long after that, just 2 days after that, you have a full moon in Sagittarius. And so that really that's kind of how it goes. And that full moon in Sagittarius has a lot of fire to it, and we will be making a video about that particular day because as we usually do.
Right.
And then I think the 15th is also, so June 9th and June 15th are two of the hardest days. June 15th, you have Mars square Uranus, and
Hmm.
that's the day that Jupiter also squares Saturn.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
uh, that's kind of it in a nutshell, this idea of fast energy moving forwards and then a slowdown and then some sort of challenge where you have to kind of stop and assess and make some decisions and decide how you're going to rise to that challenge. So, yeah,
Yeah. Okay. Can we move on to the week by
yeah, let's
week? I
move
think
on.
we're ready for that.
Yeah, I think so. Yep. So now let's just move on to the calendar here. Yeah. And yeah, let's just start with that.
Okay. So the week starts at the last quarter moon
Hmm.
as right before the sun enters Gemini. So there's some, releasing of the last pattern. We can think about it like that. And then we go on through that week. We've got the 22nd Venus trine Mars
Hmm.
and Sun sextile Neptune. Those are both really positive, lovely aspects. And it's interesting. On the 24th, if you look at Sun trine Pluto, that's a lot of powerful energy to dig into whatever your curiosities are. I really like that. And then with Mercury conjunct Uranus the same day, that just speaks to me of a lot of real excitement around the direction you're moving in. Of course, Mercury conjunct Uranus for some people is going to feel like a lot of anxiety, but I always think of Uranus, the opposite side of the coin of excitement and anxiety. And oftentimes, if we really work with it, we can shift that, I think. So then that's also the same day, the 24th, when Saturn enters Aries. That is a huge shift. And that's something that you really want to look at your chart. Where is Aries in your chart? That area of your life is going to really step into focus over the next few years as an area where you've got a lot to learn, whether you like it or not, whether you want to or not. This is an area where a lot of maturity is going to start at this point to develop.
Hmm.
Mm,
Yeah, and Saturn going into Aries is joining Neptune that is freshly in
right.
Aries. So there's really this stack up starting to happen. We had a stack up in faster moving planets earlier this year, but now it's these bigger, slower planets that are moving in and really activating something. I mean, Neptune probably activated more of sort of a dream or an ideal. Well, Saturn brings in concrete reality, something that must be structured or boundaried or something. There's a way in which you must work with your energy in a more contained way with Saturn going into Aries. So definitely take a look, as Laurie said, of where that is in your chart. It's very informative.
We need to make a video about that, Jenny.
We do. Wait, we did.
Did we?
Well, we made one about, we did actually, yes, of Neptune going into Aries. Uh, and then the next day you have Mercury entering Gemini, and look how quick Mercury's, it's just left Uranus and then it enters Gemini and then it sextiles Saturn, like all boom, 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 right next to each other. So it is very, very, very quick, very energized. And what I think is funny about this week too is it is the Balsamic Moon week. It's the ending of the moon cycle. And the waning moon and the ending of the cycle is always a time that we are asked to turn inwards to kind of do some self-reflection. And it's funny thinking about that against all of this energy coming in, so it's a little bit like having to, witness all this energy come into your life and then ask yourself how it's impacting you. Like take a moment to watch yourself react to the different influxes of energy coming in around you. Because then you have that new moon on Gemini in the 26th, and that's where we're kind of starting the next piece, but not till Mercury has sextiled Neptune as well.
Yeah, just thinking about it really is interesting, like you said, going into being in this dark phase of the moon with all that activity, thinking of Mercury as the messenger and what has it just picked up? It's just picked up Uranus, and yet it's in the dark phase of the moon. That's
Yeah.
interesting. It could really, to me, it really suggests anxiety while I'm sleeping.
Or something about because it's the dark moon, like really paying attention to your intuitive sense, really
Mm.
paying attention to what's bubbling up from those less conscious reaches of your psyche, because there's some really good information stored in there. So I do like that idea of, yeah, it is a little bit of like you need to turn inwards a bit and just watch what's bubbling up, like really adopt that objective witnessing stance that Mercury can be really good at, even though it's moving so quickly. So that's really what you're being called to do, in my
And
view.
shift the anxiety to excitement.
Yeah, like just embrace. There's a turning to and embracing. Um, yeah, and then and then we break down our next week here at the new moon in Gemini, and that takes us through this week here, and using some fancy purple here. But that really gives you just to look at this week ahead. And, the new moon is always that time of, okay, the moon has joined the sun. And so now you're beginning a cycle. Now, the new moon's always interesting because it is the brand new beginning, but think of it as a seed being planted in the soil. Like you plant that seed and you don't know what it's doing for a while. You don't know if it's split open, you cover it over, you water it, you kind of say, I hope that you grow here, and then you won't see, anything until the crescent moon phase, which is a few days later. So planting your seed here, or something to do with intellectual pursuits, something to do with your communication, some project you're trying to get out there. This is a good time to think about that new moon in Gemini. And then you have Mercury continuing on its powerful and fast, path here as it trines Pluto. So now it starts to do, it's done all the things that the sun has also done. And then you have their conjunction on the 30th. So this week kind of gives you some time to sort of process like what's happening.
Yeah,
What have you been
it's a
through?
pretty slow week right there.
Yeah. No, no, I always think different people have different views, but you can think of one way you can think of Sun conjunct Mercury is the beginning of a new Mercury cycle.
Mhm.
So this is the conjunction when Mercury's moving forwards, and then it's going to, go through its whole process of retrograding and so on and so forth. So you can think of this as the beginning, and you can think of that. This Mercury's very powerful in Gemini here, conjunct the Sun. So this is really adding a lot more weight to just the new moon in Gemini. This week is a good time to really plant some seeds. And I think it's kind of nice that it's such a quiet week because you might want to really think about what needs to be planted. I mean, especially there's a trine to Pluto too. I mean, I think there's
Right.
something very powerful here about what seeds to
Yeah.
plant during this week.
Yeah.
Oh.
So wherever Gemini is, and we'll go into that with the individual impacts, but in that house is where you'll be planting that seed for the new moon
Hmm.
that will be fully illuminated on the full moon and then on the larger cycle, fully illuminated in another 6 months.
Oh, and then we'll start with the next week with the first quarter in Virgo. And that just brings a practical focus. I actually like that first quarter. First quarters are always a crossroads. It's always a time to take action. And that first quarter is the practicality of Virgo. So you being all in this kind of air and fire, and you've planted the seed and done some kind of, dance around your seed, that you're trying to plant. And then at the first quarter, it's like, okay, let's take some practical steps. Let's bring it back down to earth and start taking some practical steps. So that's kind of how I see that first part.
Yeah, and then we go into what have we got? We've got Venus sextiling Jupiter, Mercury sextiling Mars. Those 2 days, the fourth and fifth, are both, you know, potentials. There's a lot of excitement in those. But then on the sixth, we hit that Venus entering Taurus. Venus has been moving along wherever it's been moving, Aries, I guess.
Yeah.
It's been moving along in Aries. And now it steps into Taurus. And that's where things really kind of slow down. Venus is very happy to get out of Aries. It was not very happy in Aries because, Aries is a Mars ruled sign. Venus is not real happy in a Mars ruled sign. Venus going into Taurus is extremely happy. Taurus is a Venus ruled sign. So Venus slows down and starts smelling the roses, as you can think about it that way. But this really does slow things down. And then we get into more of the more difficult parts of the month. We've got Mercury conjuncting Jupiter on the 8th, but then Mercury entering Cancer. So that again slows us down a bit.
Mhm.
Mercury getting into Cancer, our thinking goes into a quieter place, a more emotional place. We're more, yeah, more settled. Again, that slows us down more. And then we get into some of those squares. There's a bunch of them on the 9th, aren't there?
Yeah.
Mercury square Saturn, Venus square Pluto, Mercury square Neptune, and Jupiter entering Cancer. That's a hugely powerful day.
Yeah.
What
I
would
think
you say about that day? Wow.
it's a big day. I mean, I sort of feel like all of the prior things we just talked about are leading you up to that.
Yeah.
And I feel
Yeah.
like it's really nice that, as you said, like Venus entering Taurus and starting to slow you down. It's
Yeah.
almost like I was thinking about Venus entering Taurus as a symbol for, you've been go, 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 you're really pushing forwards. Maybe you feel, you might feel a lot of anger, a lot of indignation, like there's a lot of energy to that. And if you keep at that pace, you hit burnout. And
Mhm.
so Venus going into Taurus is like a relief, like, oh, thank
Yeah.
goodness,
Yeah.
and then we're talking, Laurie and I were talking right before this, and we were talking about how Mercury entering Cancer is, and right after it's conjuncted Jupiter, when they're both still in Gemini, and it's a little bit like it's buzzing along, and then it's like, oh, I'm going to jump off this cliff into the ocean. It's time to start swimming, and it kind of just has this, whoosh, and so you kind of have all of that feeling to it, and then you come up to those squares. And yeah, it's challenging. Mercury here is in Cancer, it's squaring Saturn and Aries. So there's something that needs to be nourished on the mental level that is coming at odds with some way of you or someone else taking authority and asserting their authority. And that is a little bit brick wallish, kind of smacking into something. And then Mercury squaring Neptune at the end of the day too. It's activating actually that conjunction. So there's a lot you could talk about just in those two of just the
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
yeah.
what does that do with our minds and our thinking at that
Mhm.
point? Squaring Saturn and Neptune. There's the need to structure something that we really don't understand, can't really get a hold of properly. Something that's confusing and restrictive, or
Yeah.
stabilizing and dreamy. There's different ways that you can think about this, but I think that it would be, you know, what a great time with those two to, dig into your artwork, get serious about some process of meditation or expression, something along those lines. But then Venus square Pluto, that's very intense. That's an intense questioning of your values, of what you see as worthy.
Mm, yeah.
A lot of intensity in that. Oh, just think about the babies born on that day.
Yeah, that really brings a huge sort of underworld dimension to any, all things relationship or things to do with money, and
Yeah.
also things that might be of interest that day. Like on the mundane level, Pluto squaring Venus could be, we'll see some things about finances and probably stocks and resources and things like that.
Yeah, watch what's going
Personal,
on with cryptocurrency,
yeah,
or what kind of gazillion dollar jets our administration is accepting from other countries.
urgent jets. But Venus square Pluto on a personal level, I mean, that's a day of intensity. That's a day of, you know, something forced into your view that you weren't expecting. Maybe there's some secret buried in a relationship or something surprising about your financial situation that comes at you. There's something interesting about that. And as always, look at your own chart for where that might fall, because that's pretty early on in fixed signs. So we're talking like 3 degrees of Aquarius, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or things that might be affected. But then Jupiter enters Cancer, and that is just, I sort of feel like a sigh of relief with that. Like Jupiter really likes being in Cancer. It's considered to be exalted in this sign. And it just brings in this, I don't know, this kind of lush, nourishing, expansive energy that I really like. I think it really brings in a connection with the intuition, and the richness of your intuition and like trusting your instincts, listening to your intuition, adopting an attitude of care for others, perhaps being, maybe a bit protective and cautious about what might be going on, and just kind of having that attitude. But essentially, it really brings in, it's a cardinal sign, so it's very initiating. So there's something here that is really growing in your life, and it's growing in this really emotionally robust way. So
And we will
like
be
that.
making a video about Jupiter's entrance into Cancer because that is a big deal.
Yeah.
Jupiter is a 12-year cycle, so it stays in each sign for approximately a year. So wherever it's going, Jupiter just expands things. It really makes things bigger. It expands that area of the life. So we will be making a video about that.
Sure, sure will.
Yes.
Oh, and then we have our kind of final segment of the season here, close to it as we hit that full moon in Sagittarius, which
Hmm.
it's quite the full moon. I'll be actually looking forward to making a video about that one. There's a lot of fire energy in that day. There's a lot happening in that day. So in that full moon picture itself. So that'll be interesting to talk about. But Sagittarius, the explorer sign. So bringing in a celebration of full exploratory illumination. And then Mercury sextiling Venus. That's just I don't know. We tend not to focus on aspects like that too much, but that's just a really nice connection between how you want to talk about, what you care about, and just being able to easily and effortlessly say what you need to say. Should you want to say it? You have to want it. But
You know what I really like? I like that after that first quarter moon on the second, we had all that kind of quiet and positive stuff, and then all those hard things on the
yeah.
ninth. And then here again, we've got the full moon, but we've got a bunch of quiet days. And then we hit the 15th, where we again have some real challenges. Mars square Uranus. Those are when those two planets come together, there's a real volatility in that, isn't there, Jenny? That's
Yes.
a very volatile one. And then Jupiter
Mhm.
square Saturn.
Yeah.
I have a hard time articulating or really fully understanding how those two planets work together in a square. A square always brings in a challenge. Jupiter brings in abundance and expansion, and Saturn brings in contraction and restriction. And when those two come together, it's very uncomfortable. And this has been going on for a long time.
Mm.
This is the third pass of that square. Is that right, Jenny?
It's the third time, and it's interesting because it's the only time that they are in these cardinal signs of Aries and Cancer, and this is the final one. So the first two were in mutable signs; they were in Gemini versus Pisces, and so that brought about different things. But there's a little more wiggle room in those, a little more learning available. But this is happening in cardinal signs, so they're both very determined. They're both initiating signs, and they both have kind of their own agenda, and they're also, it's happening at the Aries point, so very early on. That's 0 degrees, or you can also call it the cardinal point, meaning it's very publicly visible.
Mhm.
So this tension is going to be publicly visible. And on a personal level, I mean, there's so many ways you can talk about it, right? And
Mhm.
like on a personal level, Saturn kind of in Aries kind of represents your personal will and the constraints around that personal will. And you're trying to, move forwards in the world and like, make your way with that Aries energy. But it's very constrained by reality. And Jupiter, on the other hand, in Cancer, I mean, Jupiter also is in a much happier position in Cancer than Saturn is in Aries. But Jupiter is kind of bringing in more like the emotional side and staying in touch with your intuition, essentially, as you're moving forwards in this very dynamic way that Saturn and Aries represents. So I think it is challenging, it is difficult, but I think it also represents the the reality of push and pull in our lives. There's always this push and pull and this desire to expand outwards, but then have to do inner work, and there's always this tug of war going on anyway. And then this square merely brings it to our attention in a way that we cannot look away.
Mhm.
And in a lot of ways, even though it's stressful and difficult, and it's really just a challenge to rise to. It's like, can you rise to the occasion that this challenge represents? Because it really brings in a lot of dynamic. I mean, it is a dynamic energy to be in cardinal signs here.
Yeah, and
So,
if you think about, um, how this brings in this idea of, if you think of Jupiter as belief and Saturn as like testing, that testing of beliefs,
mm,
testing of, what's really,
mm,
yeah, what do you really believe in? I think there's something in here
Yeah.
that we're all kind of questioning what's important.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. And just on the bigger social scale of, valuing this, fiery energy to move forwards and be number one and take over and be selfish and be self-involved, and all that matters is your agenda. That's kind of the darker side of it, and Jupiter as a sort of representation of the grace of, but we're all connected. We're all emotionally connected. We're all emotional beings long before we were anything else, that we had this, that part of our brains developed long before anything else. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like, I mean, it's almost like that video we made, Laurie, about the Pope, where it's like on one hand you have this like ruthlessness of the regime that doesn't seem to be bothered about cruelty, and then you have this new Pope coming along saying, no, hold on a minute, we need to kind of base things on these, like the social construction of like compassion and kindness. So you can kind of see those two forces pitted against each other in a
And
way.
isn't it
So
interesting that this reminded you of the video we made about the Pope, because the Pope has that aspect in his natal chart,
right.
as do I.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, that Jupiter
Mhm.
squaring Saturn, always questioning and having to work through doubts about faith, about belief,
Yeah.
about, yeah, where should we expand our generosity and
Mhm.
where should we hold tight to what we own? I mean, there
Mhm.
is the financial piece, the spiritual piece. That aspect, I think, is really extremely dynamic. You said, I don't believe I read it. I apologize, but you said you had written about this aspect.
Yeah, I did. I wrote an article about this, and I wrote about it from the kind of healing perspective, like wellness and healing and how to handle this. And actually, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it was fun to write that article. And but what I really you can take away from it is this is a natural state of affairs. This isn't something abnormal to have these two pitted against each other, because in a certain way, in a simplest way, you can think of Jupiter as the inhale.
Right.
As you inhale and you expand and you take in life, and then you exhale, and Saturn is the exhale, and you contract and you let things go, and then the process continues. And so this is really a symbol for, what it means to be human, in our society, and handle all these outside stresses and how you want to respond to them, and then how you want to do the inner work of supporting yourself and nourishing yourself and going on retreat and connecting with people and so on and so forth. So you can really think of that inhale, exhale, and you're just noticing, hey, do I tend to inhale, for longer than I exhale? Or, is it, or I exhale longer? And really just noticing those things in your physical body tells you a lot about how you handle stress. So
Huh,
on a simple
interesting.
level, you can
Well,
look at it like that.
let's remember to put a link below to that article. I assume it's on your website.
Hmm.
So let's make sure we link that, because that
Okay.
could be really interesting for people. It's a very important aspect. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Laurie.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could obviously talk for hours about that, but let's finish out
Mhm.
this season. And
Mars enters
oh,
Virgo.
yay!
Not that Mars is terribly delighted to be in Virgo, but I think Mars is probably happy to get out of Leo, where it's been forever. It's,
Yeah.
it's been playing around, it entered Leo way back before its retrograde, and then retrograded into Cancer, came back in Leo, and has just been a very, very long period of time there in Leo. So it's finally actually moving along at a decent clip. Mars is a 2-year cycle, so it's never as fast as, Mercury or Venus, but it is finally moving along. So,
Nice.
you can look at your own chart and see where Virgo is, and really getting clear that that's an area where you can start moving forward with
Yeah.
more oomph.
Yeah. And or, with an organized way of thinking about things, and with the desire to make a difference and be helpful and so on and so forth. So, yeah, Mars and Virgo, helpful.
Yeah.
And then we'd have our last quarter in Pisces, and then Jupiter does its second. We've already talked for ages about Jupiter and Saturn, so it does square Neptune, and linking the two together. So we have made a video about that. So we'll make sure there's a link to the video about Neptune, Saturn, and Aries. But Jupiter also, I mean, really, I just think of Jupiter as expanding the importance of the connection between Saturn and Neptune, which is really just the absolute marker of the times we're in. Another way of saying expansion and contraction, in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
the ideals versus the reality, that sort of thing. So,
So interesting, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
mhm.
Neptune and Saturn both hand in hand there.
Yeah, and then we have the sun enter Cancer, and it continues on. And this is a very very potent month. There's just a lot of activity. There's a lot of potential and opportunity, and there's also the need to handle some conflict, the need to handle difficulty and conflict, and trust that you've done the work with the objectivity of Gemini to really lean into that. So, okay,
Okay. Are we ready to move
yeah, let's do
forward?
individual impacts. Are we ready?
Okay.
Okay, so let's move into those of you who have Aries rising.
Okay, so for people who have Aries rising, the Gemini season is really focusing its attention in your third house. The third house is the area of communication. It's the area of, yeah, really, bottom line, communication. Where do we learn communication? We learn communication in the relationships with the people that are in our immediate environment. So part of this third house is that whole idea of immediate environment and the people that populate that. That would be your siblings, your cousins, your neighbors, people in your neighborhood, the people you encounter at the grocery store, people who populate your life that you don't choose. That's how I think of the third house. So this is where you can gather a lot of information in this area during this time. Every year at Gemini season, this is the area that's lit up. On the 26th, I want you to remember if you have Aries rising, the 26th is the new moon. So, what is the seed that you want to plant to grow more curiosity, more understanding about those relationships or about how you communicate? It would be a good time to start a communication project, something like
Mhm.
that. So, you want to think about that. But like we said, the early part of this season, there's a lot of activity. Things are just kind of bubbling along quickly. And then we slow down and we hit some conflicts, some difficulties. And where do you think we're going to bump into those difficulties if we've got Aries rising, Jennie?
Well, it is likely that some of those conflicts might simply happen between you and your family, or something to do with you and your home life. That's where the square between Saturn and Jupiter is going to fall, and then there's some other things too that imply tension in the same place. So you just want to be really mindful, just how you're handling your Aries energy. Are you being responsible with it? Are you managing yourself? You managing, maybe you have some frustration, or maybe you just have a lot of energy and you need to manage that. And that may come at odds between something your family needs from you. Perhaps your family or even your house
Yeah, yeah.
might need, a bit of care, a bit of, you paying attention to it. And you're kind of like, I don't want to deal with this right now. I'm busy doing my communication things. But this is just part of the process. And it's something that you're going to have to work with. And you will learn a great deal from if you can rise to the challenge of what that presents. And it'd be easy probably with Gemini season, maybe to kind of fly off the rails a little bit with your voice. And the task for you will be, can you respond to this tension by perhaps first pausing, adopting an objective stance, and perhaps listening to what people around you are saying before you respond. I think that would be a really helpful thing to do
Mhm.
during this time. So that's what I'm seeing. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that you brought up it might not be your family at all. It might be something to do with your house. It might be, you're ready to you're having a conflict with somebody you hired to do some work at your house, something like that. But
Mhm.
yeah, that conflict between how you manage yourself in the face of an issue that somehow has to do with your home or family.
Mhm. Yeah.
So. go back to the curiosity. Plant a
Yeah.
seed for developing more curiosity about how you use your voice.
Yeah, nice. Okay, let's move on to Taurus rising. All right, so those of you with Taurus rising, this Gemini season is going to light up your second house. Now, bear in mind, this is always where Gemini season is going to land. So if you have a pattern of in May and June having a big focus on your finances or perhaps how you feel about yourself, there's a piece about self-worth in the second house. Or it might have to do with, resources, possessions. Those are all second house topics. So that's where the sun is shining. And with Gemini here, there's potentially a lot of ability to be really objective about what's happening with their finances. Or you might be curious about how you feel about yourself and just kind of notice places that are a struggle and which places are better, which places are working well for you. And in either case, the whole first part of Gemini season is really directing a ton of energy to this part of your life. So there's a lot of zhuzh going on here. You might be thinking about something you need to do with your money, or there's or something about the things that you own. Those are all the topics, and we do have a Gemini new moon kind of early on in the season, and that will be a really good time on May 26th to really, plant a seed for clear communication here. Really just anchor that seed in the ground and let that take root, because a little bit later on in the season, as we mentioned, there is a lot of potential for conflict, a lot of struggle, the potential for a challenge that's going to come your way. And Laurie, what do you think about where that challenge might land for a Taurus rising person?
Well, I think for those of you with Taurus rising, there's a real push right now, just beginning. There's a real push of getting to know yourself on a deeper level, getting to know your own unconscious motivations, and expanding your voice. And the conflict is that, like, what are you learning about yourself and how do you speak about it? I think that's where the conflict is going to come in. You might want to say more than you're really ready to say, or you might hesitate to say what you need to say about what you're learning about your own inner nature.
Mhm.
Something
Yeah.
along those lines. What do you think?
Yeah, I know it's interesting thinking about it. One of the things the 12th house can also be is having to deal with some kind of illness, like having to deal with something difficult that comes your way that actually teaches you a hell of a lot about what you can survive and what you're capable of. With Aries there, it might really sort of make it crystal clear that you have a strength that you didn't know that you had. And then the challenge is, okay, well, how do you tell people around you about it? How do you inform the people in your immediate environment what you need based on what you've learned about yourself? I could see some tension there. It seems like a pretty good growth curve, and both of these houses have to do with a learning, and that's the part I like. That the ideas adopt that Gemini curiosity, be objective and observe whatever it is, challenging thing that's going on behind the scenes, and use that to help you figure out how you want to talk about it with the people around you without having to lash out or do it in a way that doesn't feel very skillful. You really have the tools to rise to the challenge and do it skillfully, I think.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting. I like that.
yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on to Gemini rising.
And if you have Gemini rising, this is very personal for you. You probably start out this Gemini season feeling pretty good. The sun has moved into your first house. It feels like it's all about you. And, there's just a lot of appreciation for yourself, for your ability to show up with a lot of curiosity and connect with people pretty easily. People with Gemini rising have a lot of skill in that area. So this is where the focus is. On the 26th, you want to remember that the 26th of May is when we have the new moon. So you want to think about that as a time to plant a seed of curiosity about yourself or how people see you, how people respond to you, how you kind of show up in the world. So plant a seed to yeah, get curious about maybe some change you want to make in your own presentation. So you want to think about that. There's a lot of activity around yourself. Now, as we go deeper into the season, as we talked about in the beginning of this video, things get complicated and they're not quite as simple as just, oh, all fun and games and it's all about you. It gets more complicated and there is the tendency or the suggestion that there's going to be some conflict here.
Hmm.
So, where do you see the conflict coming in for people with Gemini rising?
Well, it is interesting because we're thinking about that Jupiter Saturn square. So we're thinking about Aries and Cancer pitting off, facing off against each other, or pitting against each other. And for those of you with Gemini rising, that's landing in the two places of your life that have to do with your community and the kind of social resources that are available through community, and then your personal resources that you are your kind of the things that you carry around with you. On a simple level, you could think about this as the tension between what the culture has to say about how you should spend your money, and then how you personally want to spend your money. Like maybe your community is sort of suggesting that you should spend your money in a certain way to support whatever political parties or something like that, and then on a personal level you're like, oh, I don't agree with that, I don't want to do that. So that's one way to look at it. It could be a lot more internal. The second house, especially the Cancer, there has to do with how you feel about yourself, your self-esteem. Like, do you value yourself? Is there a struggle with self-love, that kind of can bring in those kinds of things, and have that be pitted against the way you're being seen in your community. With the Aries in your 11th house of community, you may be seen as some kind of leader, yet you've kind of got these tender insecurities that you're having to deal with. That would be another way this could play out. So think about what that is. And as you're thinking about that push pull, think of this as a challenge, something you want to rise to, the occasion you want to rise to. And as a Gemini rising person, don't forget that your voice is very important, and how you use that voice is very important and is very valuable. I think that's part of it. Yeah. What do you
It,
think?
it, it's interesting. I think about, Saturn moving into that 11th house. There's some way in which you are beginning, just barely beginning to understand your responsibility to community.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, there's this expansion of your own sense of yourself and how you might want to hoard money. So there's some conflict between your desire to expand your self-worth and your understanding that you are also responsible for the larger community. And like you said, Jennie, I liked how you said that, standing up to the situation. You understand that these are both cardinal signs. You have to take action on this. You can't just say, oh, there's this conflict, so I'm going to sweep it under the rug. You have to face this conflict and work with it and figure out what is mine and it's going to make me feel good about myself at the same time as I'm taking responsibility for my community and my connection with my community.
Hmm. Yeah, yep, I really, this one, I guess I'll just say one other thing just as a way to think about it. For those of you who do have, maybe maybe you're trying to figure out your retirement depending on your age and so on, but it might also be that you're trying to figure that out. You're trying to figure out where to invest the money, but you don't like the different places that you can invest your money in because they're owned by, these very, 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 very wealthy people who are, being problematic. So there might be some way in which you're being pushed to figure out what's the most important for you and trying to make those decisions. And so it's just another way to think about it. And that just came to my mind. But anyway, all right, blah
I
blah.
have such funny things that want to come out, but keep
I know,
moving.
I know. Okay, now we're going to move on to those of you with Cancer rising. So those of you with Cancer rising, Gemini season is an interesting juxtaposition because what it does is it ushers in all this light, airy, quick, investigative type energy into the most hidden, tucked away, unconscious part of your life. So I think it's quite an interesting season. It's a really important time for those of you with Cancer rising to just adopt an air of curiosity and sort of, poke around at what's going on in those layers of your unconscious that maybe are layers that are still needing some healing. They still need some therapy. They still need some kind of, understanding. And just adopt this curious attitude as you look at that instead of getting kind of hung up on, oh, I don't know if I can, whatever these different pieces are. So I actually think it's a very useful time, especially this particular season where there's so much energy coming in the first half of the season. There's so much external stimulus and all these ideas and there's community groups and there's things over here and there's a lot happening. And so it's a really great time to kind of figure out where you're located in that storm of busyness, and what's happening. And especially at the new moon, which happens on May 26th, really think about what seed you want to plant. Like, what information do you want to uncover that has to do with your subconscious or unconscious patterns? What do you need to learn? What do you want to look at? How can you harness this energy in a positive way? So those are things you'll want to think about then, because as we get into the second half of the season, there's a lot of more tension later on. There's some challenge, some tension, potentially some conflict. And the question for you is going to be, how do you want to, rise to that occasion? How do you want to rise from the information you're gathering in that 12th house to rise to the occasion of this potential conflict that's happening?
Mhm.
So, yeah, Laurie, where do you think that's
The
going to show up?
conflict itself, the conflict itself is held in the fact that you're really pushed right now as Saturn moves into Aries. You're really pushed to be facing some reality and responsibility around career or public persona. There's some way that you're really having to face reality or take responsibility there at the same time as your sense of yourself is expanding. Your sense of yourself as a really sensitive, protective person is rising. So there's a conflict there. How do I show up in the biggest part of who I am at the same time as I'm facing the reality and doing the real work that I need to do around social reputation or career? How does that look on a personal level, Jenny? What do you think?
Right. I know it's, well, I mean, one way it could look too is with Cancer on the ascendant, there's definitely a suggestion that you may be working in a healing field or be responsible for the care and nurturing of individuals. That could be part of whatever your path is. And it's cardinal. So there's a strong initiative to, sort of take charge in that part of your life and embrace that expansion. But there's just some discomfort with, Aries in the 10th house and Saturn there's a lot of responsibility. It's like you have to really adopt this kind of authoritarian air or air of authority. Probably authoritarian is probably not the right word, but but the air of authority, you really need to kind of step into that and take responsibility for how you want to move yourself forwards in your professional life or your most public life. So I mean, yeah, it's definitely some tension there. But I think, the first and the 10th house are two of the most, or are the two most powerful houses. So having this happen while you have to do this inner work behind the scenes, I think this is a very important time frame for anyone
Mhm.
with Cancer rising. This is a time for you to step up to the plate and really just embrace what this challenge is. And I just say go for it
Yeah, yeah,
because this is it. It's
absolutely.
on. Now's the
Absolutely. I mean, that's cardinal on the 10th and the 1st. And this really provides an amazing opportunity to really take yourself on in what your chosen field is or your chosen way of showing up in the world. This is a really powerful time.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I'll keep that in mind.
All right, keep that in mind. Time to
Okay.
take yourself on, Jenny.
Right. Let's go on to Leo season now.
Leo rising. So if you have Leo rising, the Gemini season, the focus of it is in your 11th house. This is the area of your life that really connects you to larger communities. You can think of that 11th house as the community that supports you, the community that really supports you to what you want and desire. You can think of it as where you receive from others. You know, the 11th house, it's not necessarily your friends. There may be some overlap, there may be friends involved, but the 11th house is really like-minded others more so than friends. But this is where there's a lot of anyone with Leo rising, there's a lot of curiosity about community, about what community means, about who I can find to support me. There's all of that. So you want to think on the 26th of May is when we come to the new moon. So you want to think about that period, that new moon as a time to plant a seed. You know, look at what does community mean to you? What are you curious about developing within the context of community? What would you like to see developed there? And, you know, do some sort of a ritual, plant a seed for the growth of community in your life. So that's, you know, the first part of the season is just all pretty much about that. And then we hit some challenges. And the challenges that we're talking about, the challenge that we're really focusing on with this video is the challenge of Saturn moving into Aries, Jupiter moving into Cancer and forming a square between them. So for those of you who have Cancer rising, how is that challenge going to show up? What do you think, Jennie?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. They're falling in your ninth and your 12th houses. So Saturn is moving to Aries into your ninth house, and Jupiter and Cancer in your 12th house. And when you look at those two houses together, first of all, what they have in common is they're both places to learn. They're things that we need to learn. And let's talk about the ninth house first. The ninth house is your worldview, your ability to think critically. And with Saturn moving in here, you're having to take responsibility for your viewpoint in a new way. But it's not just your viewpoint, it's also all of your experiences. The
Mhm.
ninth house is experiential. It's where you travel, or you go get higher education, or there's a legal focus here. There can be a religious focus here. So all of those things are what's really coming to play, where you're having to take responsibility for your worldview and your philosophy in a new way, in an outward yang kind of way. I mean, it's in people's faces to some degree. And then meanwhile, Jupiter is like quietly entering that 12th house and dramatically expanding your intuitive sense, dramatically expanding your connection to the deeper layers of your being, the place where you feel interconnected with all the life around you. I mean, these are deep issues. These are deep, deep spiritual contemplations. So it's a little bit like these deep spiritual contemplations might be a little bit at odds with your sort of belief system that is the sum of all of your actions you've taken over your life. So that's where there might be a
Hmm.
little bit of, I think this is a crisis of consciousness
Hmm.
for folks with Leo rising. This is a time to really understand kind of what we talked about earlier, especially you did, Laurie, was the struggle of the beliefs.
Mhm.
What are the beliefs, and then what are your intuitive knowings, and how are those kind of coming at odds with each other? And of course, with this, we're asking, this sort of, this rising to the challenge sort of vibe. Like it's time to rise to this challenge. And as you rise to this challenge as a Leo rising person,
Hmm.
you just stand to be a much more dynamic person in all of this. Your philosophy is standing to be lined up with your spiritual way of knowing. So
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The only thing I really want to add, I really like the way you talked about that. The only thing I want to add is that 12th house can also, yeah, it holds all that is hidden from us. So it holds our spiritual understanding as well as our understanding of our own deep psychological patterns. So, yeah, that struggle is between what we are learning to see that is kind of deeply hidden in us and how we are holding our worldview. And
Mhm.
like you said, there is a crisis in consciousness. There's this facing the reality of your worldview, and does it match what you are now preparing
Exactly.
to really learn about your deepest hidden sides of yourself?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It was
Great.
really interesting to think about
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Okay, let's move on to Virgo rising. All right. So, folks with Virgo rising, of whom I know a few,
Few.
uh, quite a few actually. But anyway, Virgo rising brings in the 10th house. So, Gemini season is always going to illuminate your 10th house. The 10th house is the most public house. It's where I think you said earlier, Laurie, that your public persona really kind of shows up. So it can be your profession, your career, the place where you spend a lot of your time, but you may not have that. And so it also refers to your social reputation, which again is just simply going to be how you show up in public. So that's what Gemini season is bringing. And there's a suggestion here with Gemini in your 10th house that you are some sort of thought leader, or that you are someone who expresses yourself through the word, whether written or verbal. Words are very important. And, whatever it is that you do for your work, think about language. Think about how you string words together. Have you written a book? Or how do you talk to people you work with on a daily basis? What's happening here? Because that's really where the attention is. Now, what's really cool is early on in Gemini season, there's a lot of energy being directed here. I mean, this is a great time to really get clear about what you have to offer through your professional life, and I think that's a really important keynote. And when you come to the Gemini new moon, which is on May 26th, so fairly early on in the season, it is a great time to plant a seed for the things that you would like to see grow and expand in your life that have to do with all how you express yourself and how you communicate. So that's kind of a summary of the beginning part of the season. As we move in, as we talked, Laurie and I talked about how things kind of slow down as we get to the middle of the season. And then there's some snags, there's some challenges, there's some pressure being placed and bringing up issues in another part of your life. And for you, what we're talking about is the Saturn square Jupiter aspect, which is in Aries and Cancer. So, Laurie, where does that land in this Virgo person's life and what might it signify?
Well, let's think about that. Saturn's moving into Aries, into your eighth house. So there's a way in which you are newly facing reality and ready to roll up your sleeves and work within the realm of how you navigate the really deeper issues of relationships. It's really about yeah, setting boundaries, learning how to set boundaries. There's a lot of that you're going to be really working on over the next few years. But right now, as Saturn first steps in there, I always think of Saturn's first job is to tell us to face reality. So as we're like facing reality of how we are doing in navigating other people's deep issues, we are hitting that square with Jupiter that's just stepped into the 11th house. How is the reality of how we're navigating other people's deep issues in conflict with our need to expand our community?
Mm,
That's the conflict, is the expansion of community versus the facing reality of how much work you have to do to navigate individual issues with people, possibly in the community, possibly not.
mm,
They might be two very separate things. I think in my case, they're two very separate
yeah.
things. I mean, I can see exactly how this plays out
Mm,
for
yeah.
myself. And it is, there's a just preparation for expanding community. But what does that mean in terms of navigating deep issues of relationships,
Yeah.
individual relationships?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me about this one is it really gets at that whole issue of like, hey, there's this group you want to hang out with, whether it's a group of friends or it's a class you're going to or something more, directly community related. This group that you're excited about, but there's people in that group that you're not excited about. And you may not feel that you can easily connect with certain people. And there's that whole, but are you really not going to go to the group gathering because there's one or two people that you just have a hard time with? And I think what the square is saying is, you do need to set boundaries. So what's the right boundary for you? You get to decide. You don't have to go to the community thing. You really have the agency to decide. But the real question is like, but are you going to prevent yourself from expanding in this way that is really going to be helpful for you? And I think that's really what the question is here. Is like, because we've all been in those group situations with
Or,
somebody who are like, oh, you know.
or
Mhm.
if the eighth house situation is not connected to the community, if it's someone from outside the community that distracts or makes it difficult for you to expand that community, maybe the issue is to bring them together.
Yeah.
Bring that, yeah, bring
Yeah.
that into the community in some way.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. But it's a great one for thinking about. I do, how do you not be in your own way for what's best for you as far as connecting with other people, right? I mean, I think that's kind of what it brings
yeah,
up, clearly for me. And that really, that you are in the driver's seat. I mean, these are cardinal signs. You do get to decide how you want to handle this, and how do you want to most embrace that expansion,
yeah,
really.
yeah. And
So,
the bottom line, if you want to expand your community, you have to be able to set boundaries with individual people inside the community or outside that are impacting it.
yes, you do.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we?
Yes, we shall.
All right. So now we're going to move on to Libra rising.
So, for those of you with Libra rising, the focus of Gemini season is in your ninth house. So basically, the ninth house, we talk about it as worldview. There's so many things that comprise our worldview. There's so many things that are part of that ninth house because it really is about our experiences. Our worldview is made up of our experiences and the understandings that we gain through those experiences. So you think of that ninth house as travel, education, our understanding of other cultures, our experience of other cultures, politics, religion, all the experiences from those things that make up our worldview. If you've got Libra rising, you've got a lot of curiosity around all of those things. Um, and during this season, there's just a lot of activity there. There's a lot of little curious rabbit holes you can probably go down in thinking about what your worldview is, trying on different ideas. At the new moon on the 26th, you want to think about planting a seed that's going to improve, increase, grow your worldview. That could be a time to, sign up to take a class or to buy your tickets to travel somewhere, whatever it is. It probably should involve some experience that will enlarge your worldview. So you want to think about that. That's a big focus, especially the early part of the season. And then we've talked about the fact that we hit a little bit of a wall here where there are some real challenges that come along later in the season. And the one that we've really chosen to talk about here is involved in the square between Saturn and Jupiter. And in this case, it's really going to bring up a challenge between the seventh and the 10th house.
Mm.
What do you think about that? How's that going to play out, Jenny?
Wow. Well, the seventh and the 10th house, in a certain way, both kind of have to do with the extensions of your identity. The seventh house is a little bit who you're with, and the 10th house is what do you do for work, right? And just on a simple level. So that's where you can think about these tensions in play. So let's break that down a little bit more. You have Saturn moving into your seventh house, which is really a statement of like having to take responsibility for yourself in a new way in relationship. And it's really interesting having Aries there, so it's like really having to have good boundaries around, how you show up as a self and then how you show up as a partner, and like what's the push and pull there. Are you someone that you're giving away too much, or do you need to be more like autonomous, or are you being a little bit sort of self-oriented and not being partner oriented? So those are some of the questions that might come up for you as Saturn moves into Aries there. And that's very much at odds with some way that you want to expand in your work life or in your most public life. And 10th house is often can be thought of profession or vocation, and it also is just your social reputation. So any social things that you're part of, that's where it shows up. So it's kind of like you really want to expand in this kind of 10th house way through your work, through your socializing, and there's some challenge around feeling restricted by your partnership status. I mean, you could have a partner and that feels like tension and that's difficult up against your workplace, but it could also be that you're single and social norms kind of dictate that we're in a partnership. So there's a whole number of ways that that could play out, but that's where the tension is between those two parts of your life. And the goal here is to rise to the challenge and to address both, and to take responsibility for whoever you are in partnership or how you show up in partners or whatever. And then also move forward in that way that you want to expand in this very public part. So I think it's something along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one is really clear. There's some way that there's a conflict between your partnership and who you want to be in your public life. There's some conflict there, and you have to be ready and willing to face the reality of that and do what is necessary to stabilize the relationship in such a way that you're able to expand yourself in a public way.
And one of the things occurs me too, Laura, is that this could also be that you have a work partner, a business partner or a work partner, and now you're being kind of pulled into this different phase of your work, and you're having to contemplate how that partnership does or doesn't fit in. I mean, so it could be a very work-oriented situation altogether, possibly too. So, but yeah, okay.
Interesting. All right, moving on.
Okay, so those of you with Scorpio rising, ooh la la. So those of you with Scorpio rising, you have Gemini in your eighth house. The eighth house is the place where all of your relationships necessarily get deeper. So it's the place where you end up bumping up against, each other's issues, and suddenly things aren't easy anymore. And suddenly, it's like all this emotional crap that you never even realized was going to be there. So that's what the eighth house is. And every Gemini season, there's an illumination in this house. There's a sort of light up of any of these kinds of issues that are coming your way. So this might be those places where you find yourself in conflict with a spouse, or it might be a place where you're having to draw better boundaries with people around you in general. Or this could be a place where you simply get to be curious, and you have
Mm,
Gemini here, so you get to just kind of be curious about other people's stuff and look at it with a light touch, which is actually extremely helpful, especially when you have Scorpio rising. That you have this ability to really hold space for other people and their intense difficulties. So during this Gemini season, be curious, adopt an objective stance as much as you can, and kind of investigate and look at what's happening. And gather information from other people's processes and gather information from how you're handling things. And listen to what's going on with people. So that's kind of the Gemini season in a nutshell. At the new moon on the 26th, you have a special opportunity to really plant a seed for a deeper understanding in this part of your life. So take advantage of that. And then use I don't know, the prodigious amount of energy that comes your way in the first part of the season. Is so much activity being directed into this Gemini house, and it's a really busy time on a lot of levels. And then things start to slow down in the middle of the season. And then lo and behold, you find yourself coming into some conflicts here and there. And Laurie, would you like to talk about this conflict to which I am referring?
Sure, I would love to talk about that. So, what we're talking about is the fact that Saturn is entering Aries and Jupiter is entering Cancer, and they pretty much immediately form a square aspect between the two of them, which creates that conflict. There's some way in which you are put in a position where you're having to face reality and put some real effort into understanding how you navigate your day-to-day realities. There could be a health issue that could arise, or something else that just kind of stands in the way of the smooth day-to-day running of your life. And the conflict comes in with, as that restriction, as you're feeling that restriction, you really are also having this need to expand your understanding in regards to your worldview, or maybe you really just had a plan to travel or do some big experiences. And then there's some restriction that comes in on the day-to-day level that kind of just pulls you up short, and you're not able to respond the way you expected. So that's where the conflict, I think, is between the day-to-day routines and your desire to grow bigger in your worldview.
Mm. Wow. Yeah. There's quite an interesting conflict there. You know, I was thinking
Yeah,
about yeah, that it could be too that you had travel plans
yeah,
and you've got some health issues.
yeah.
And it
Simple
just
as that.
yeah, it could just be, and then how are you going to handle that?
Yeah.
And it's like making distinct choices about how you want to handle that. So, okay.
Yeah, I think that covers it.
All right. Let's move on to our next victim.
Our next victim, Jenny.
Those of you who have Sagittarius rising.
All right. So if you have Sagittarius rising, this Gemini season falls right there in your seventh house. So that makes it pretty simple. Seventh house is your relationships, your major kind of contractual relationships. I think of them as the contractual relationships, marriage, spouse, business partners, your therapist, those one-on-one relationships that really hold a big space in your life. So, those of you with Sagittarius rising, you've got Gemini in that house. So, there's a lot of, you really want your relationships to have kind of a light touch and to be very communicative and hold a lot of curiosity and fun, really. So, this is a period of time as we get started in this season, there's a lot of activity around relationship. And on May 26th, we come to the new moon, which really gives you an opportunity to think about what you would like to have grow over the next period of time in this area of relationship. What kind of, what are you curious about delving into in conversations with your partner? Start a conversation, plant a seed for some new curiosity to share between the two of you, maybe something along those lines. But that's the beginning part of the season. There's all that curiosity and movement in relationship. But then we have really, it's very clear that as the season goes on, there's some serious issues that come up. There's some conflicts that have to be managed and worked with. And basically, what we're talking about is the movement of Saturn and Jupiter and how they come into a square aspect. Almost immediately as they move into these two cardinal signs. So, for those of you with Sagittarius rising, where's that conflict showing up, Jenny?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So basically, Saturn is moving into Aries into your fifth house. So what this is suggesting is some way that you need to take more responsibility for your creative pursuits and your fun. And it's time to really, sort of insist on that. Probably for your health. I mean, it's just really important to have that part. But what's happening is that Jupiter is also moving into your eighth house, which is the house of other people's stuff. So while you're figuring out how to do this new spark in your relationship where Gemini is, there's some other way in which the deeper layers and the deeper emotional layers of those connections are getting blown up and expanded. And so it might be a little bit like right when you're ready to have responsibility for having more fun, you're bumping into this deeper level of issue in your partnership.
Mm.
And that's decidedly not about fun, you know? And I think there's something about here, or maybe another way to think about it is the fifth house can be those very self-oriented creative pursuits. Like I want to do a dance class, or I want to make a huge sculpture, or, you know, something like that. And to do that takes time and effort, you know, to put it in, to make that happen. But, you know, with Jupiter in the eighth house, there's some emotional issue that is really screaming for your attention that has to do with your partnerships that needs your care and consideration. And you might be tempted to say, well, screw that. I'm just getting this creative thing going. Like, I don't have time for that. Like, deal with yourself, you know? But really, that is not going to be a good solution to whatever the issue is. That would be very one sided. And what you really want to do is figure out how to hold both. How
Right.
can you show up for this necessary emotional expansion that needs to happen? How can you show up to be possibly a support or a witness, or, you know, an act of grace for somebody who's having a great deal of difficulty while also doing the things that bring you joy? I mean, I think that it's something like that. Yeah.
I,
What are your
it
thoughts?
is an interesting one because
Mhm.
I'm thinking about, yeah, the conflict between my pleasure and someone else's issues. And
Mhm.
I also, another way I was thinking about it when you first started talking about it, I'm thinking about Saturn moving into the fifth house. And this is, I'm thinking about a particular person who um, just has had a child, and the fifth house can also be about children. So Saturn moving into that fifth house is there is serious business that you have to be paying attention to regarding how you give of yourself, how you give love is suddenly you really have to take responsibility in that area. And at the same time, this other part of your life really wants to expand. I was thinking, the responsibility of a child and the expansion of a partner's needs and
Mhm.
how those can be in conflict.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a more adult way of looking at it than my
Yeah.
way of just wanting to have fun and
You often talk about the fifth house as fun, and I always have to stop and rewind myself when you do that. And I realize it's because I have Capricorn in the fifth house.
Mhm.
So to me, the fifth house is about giving love in a responsible way. But having fun to me is always serious business. So,
Yeah, I know, and it's not just fun, like necessarily safe fun. It's like risk-taking fun. I mean, I'm a mountain biker, so I just think, you know, that's where I'm
right.
doing that. It's risky, but it's fun.
Yeah.
But and also can be self-serving. So there's a tricky, you know, it's a creative art, but there's a dance.
You also, don't you have Sagittarius in that house?
No, I got Scorpio.
Oh, you have Scorpio in that house.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, no, it's pretty deadly serious business for me. All right, well, should we move on?
Yes, let's move on.
Okay. Capricorn rising. All right, so this one is interesting, like they all are, because it's Gemini season, and interesting is a good key word. So, for those of you with Capricorn rising, Gemini lands in your sixth house. The sixth house is sort of like your lifestyle, your routines, your healthcare things that you do, like your walk that you do, and whether you meditate, and are you going to eat properly, and how's your sleeping. All of those things kind of fall in the sixth house. And it does also make reference to your working life, you know, like just the day to day. I get up, I go do this thing. So with Gemini here, there's a lot of intellectual stimulus as part of this for you. It seems like part of your daily routine should definitely be about gathering information. Like, do you look at the news? You know, do you have a journaling practice? And then what do you do for exercise? Like, do you go with somebody on a walk so you can have a nice chat while you're walking? I mean, those are all things that can be part of having Gemini in the sixth house. And during this Gemini season, like every Gemini season, there's a big focus here. I mean, the focus is on the day to day, you know, things that are going on in your life. And this Gemini season, there's a lot of energy, all kind of spinning out there for the first half of the season. There's a lot of heat and air energy that's going on, and it's directed into the sixth house. So it might feel very busy here. It might feel like there's a lot happening. Maybe you're trying to make some plans for some future things and so on and so forth. So it's very activated. And at the new moon on May 26th is a really great time to take a moment and plant a seed for greater clarity in this part of your life. Maybe you actually need to slow down here. Maybe you need to come to a better understanding of how to meet the intellectual needs of your daily living. So those are all things that may come about at the new moon. And then as we move further into the season, things really start to slow down. And then once we kind of get to that like June 9th, around there somewhere, and June 15th, things can get pretty conflicted. I mean, at that point, you might feel like you're really bumping up against something that you hadn't anticipated, except you watched our videos, so you knew. But you're really kind of bumping up against something that can create some conflict and strife. And for you, with Capricorn rising, that is happening in your fourth house, where Aries is, and Saturn's moving into, and your seventh house, which is relationships and partnerships, and that's where Jupiter's moving in and demanding some kind of expansion. So, Laurie, what do you have to say about that conflict? What might that be?
It's pretty simple, isn't it? There's some conflict between home, family, and partnership. So, it can look a million ways. It can be that you're, arguing with your partner about the need to put an addition on your house or to move, or there could be some conflict that your family doesn't like your partner or vice versa. It could be something really simple in that area, but really you want to think that your home and family is really you're just moving into a time where home and family really is going to take a lot of your responsibility and attention in a serious growth way. And at the same time, your relationship is expanding. Your relationship area, even if you're single, it's like relationship, the idea of relationship, the way you think about people who are close to your life is expanding. Your understanding of how you nurture and care for others is expanding, and it is in some way in conflict with home and family. And
Yeah.
yeah, they're both cardinal signs. They both are demanding action. So finding a way to balance and honor both ends of that is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, another way I was thinking too that this could play out is the other thing to remember is the fourth house can also represent parents. And I was thinking about someone who, is in moving into that phase of taking care of their elderly parents, and at the same time wanting to find a new partner, like wanting to expand, being single for a while and wanting to expand and find this partnership. But now they're, suddenly living with, elderly parents and kind
Oh,
of like,
that's tricky.
how is it? Yeah, like how am I going to possibly expand in my partnership life? But the thing to do here is again is to embrace the challenge. It isn't one against the other.
Right.
It's okay if that's what you're being called to do. You take that responsibility. You care for that parent, and maybe that's how you're going to meet somebody. I mean, maybe there's a neighbor that you didn't even know because you're in a new city or whatever. So the idea here is to be
Yeah.
open,
Yeah.
is to kind of work with the tension and really use that Gemini objectivity and curiosity to help support you, in figuring out the answer to this conflict for
Yeah.
you. So
Yeah. And it's, with Capricorn rising, your partnerships have to hold that energy of nurturing anyway. So the proper expansion in relationship is going to be towards someone who will be fine with the fact that you're taking care of your parents and might, really embrace that.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Aquarius rising.
Sure. All right. So for those of you with Aquarius rising, the Gemini season, the focus, as it is every year, the Gemini season's focus is in your fifth house. And the fifth house is the area where we think about how we give of ourselves most directly, most authentically. How do we give of ourselves? I think of, you know, well, back in the day, people would talk about the fifth house as the house of children, love affairs, and creativity. And it's not the hard work of children, it's the giving of, how they require that we give so much of ourselves. And love affairs, how we give of ourselves. Creativity, when we are any creative path is where we are giving of ourselves. So that's really what that house is about. And Jennie likes to talk about it also as the place that we take risks and have fun. So those are the things. What a wonderful house. The fifth house is really a wonderful house. And for those of you with Aquarius rising, you've got Gemini there. So there's a lot of curiosity, there's a lot of interest right now at the beginning of this season. There's a lot of activity going on there. So you're really feeling good and curious about how you're giving, what you're giving, whatever creative endeavors you're involved in. You want to remember that on the 26th of May, we have the new moon there in your fifth house. So you want to think about, what do you want to grow in that area? Do you want to start a new creative endeavor? Do you want to fall in love? What do you want in that house? Plant a seed for that. Do some sort of a ritual, plant a seed and see what grows out of it. That's what the new moon is really good for, is starting a process. So from there, we move into some of the more challenging parts of Gemini season. And what we have decided to really talk about with these videos is the conflict that comes as Saturn moves into Aries, Jupiter moves into Cancer, and they come into a square aspect. And this brings in the major conflict that we're seeing toward, later in this season. So for a person with Aquarius rising, where are we going to see that conflict show up, Jennie?
Well, with Saturn moving into Aries, that's going to move into your third house, and Jupiter moving into Cancer is going to move into your sixth house. So the tension is between the third and the sixth house. Now, the interesting part about this is they are both houses that, in my view, are concerned with learning. They're places where, like the third house is where you're doing a lot of your early learning and you're just sort of gathering information. Sound familiar, like Gemini. The sixth house is more like where you need to kind of get training and get tangible skills that help you navigate your lifestyle. So there's some kind of maybe there's a tension between the idea of how you're going to handle this and then the reality of what you need to do. So let's just start with, so Saturn moving into your third house is forcing you to take some sort of new responsibility regarding your voice. You are somebody who has the ability to speak with a lot of courage and a lot of effectiveness with Aries there. And with Saturn moving in there, you are being called to use your voice in perhaps a stronger, louder way, or in a way that it really imbues more responsibility or accountability. So that's what that is. And then meanwhile, Jupiter moving into Cancer is sort of saying, oh, yeah, great, but I really want to expand my self care. I really need to, kind of look after myself, make sure that I'm getting what I need from my daily routines. I need to make sure that I'm dealing with my emotions and making sure that they have an outlet. I'm caring for myself in some way. That's what Jupiter really brings in, this real desire to expand the level of kind of nourishing and maybe even slowing down in the way that you're handling the routines of your life, yet you're being called to use your voice in this more kind of outward yang type of way, so there's some kind of conflict between that. Like maybe you're, as part of that self-care, you're like, oh, I want to retreat more and step back more and have more inward time, and yet you're being asked to really speak up in your neighborhood perhaps, or with your siblings. I mean, the third house is both of those things as well. So there's a
Yeah.
tension between these two things, and it's interesting thinking about how that might be. Like, do you have any other ideas about how this could play out?
Well, in some ways, I think about these two and their connection, like the third house being the day-to-day routines of the thinking, and the sixth house, the day-to-day routines of the practical life. So
Mm,
it's like the thought processes, the voice as you're thinking of it, the thought processes are somewhat in conflict with the day-to-day routines that you want to do.
yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of hard to envision that quite directly.
No, I think that you said it in a good way. Like you're kind of thinking one thing, I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to act on this new thing. I'm going to take responsibility for this new thing. And then there's the the truth. I wouldn't say reality, but the truth of what your routines, your daily lifestyle can handle, and where,
Right,
can you handle more? Can you take on a new dimension or not? And just trying to figure that out. There's something
right.
about the tangibility and the great idea, and then
Yeah,
making that fit with the reality of the timing of, I wake up at this time and I do this, and
right.
and so on. There's something
Yeah.
very structured
Yeah,
there.
the day-to-day routines of the mind versus or in conflict in some way with the realities of the day-to-day life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting to think about that.
Hmm.
So anybody that has this Aquarius rising, send us a note. Leave us a note about what this is for you, how you see
Yeah.
this. I'd be
Yeah.
interested to know.
And ultimately, it's your life. So you're bringing these two things together. And that's the challenge is how do you honor both things that are happening here?
Yeah.
So, okay.
All right, moving on.
So for those of you with Pisces rising, ooh, look at this. We have Gemini in your fourth house. So Gemini season every year lights up your fourth house. And the fourth house, in a nutshell, is home. So that's the home that's inside of you, the emotional stability that you have as part of your personality. And that's your physical home, your house, the people you live with. It also might be connected to your lineage. So, home in that sense, like what is the lineage you are descended from? And also can be the land that you're living on. So, all of those things can really be brought together in this idea of home. So, that's what the fourth house really brings up. And with
Mm,
Gemini here, there's a lot of, I would think, sort of like curious, like kind of playful energy that you can bring into your home life, that could be really helpful. And during this Gemini season, there is a lot of energy coming into the home life here. And I mean, another thing I thought of is this could be if you have small children, your
mm,
children are in school, and that could be part of what you're trying to figure out as the home life. Are they getting the education that they need?
mm,
Is that a stress in your home life?
mm,
Or is that something you're really thinking about during this Gemini season, moving forwards into the future? So those are some of the themes and that you might be on your mind. Haha, the Gemini here. And then at the Gemini new moon on May 26th, that's going to be a really important time to plant a seed for some sort of new understanding, or maybe you're regenerating that curiosity. Family can get tiresome. Maybe you need to kickstart that that curiosity again, and just be curious about what's happening around you. So those are some of the things to think about. As the season progresses, all the activity and so on and so forth that's going on starts to slow down. And we come to this place where there's actually a lot of conflict that has to be navigated and dealt with.
mm,
And for you, that conflict is coming where Saturn and Jupiter are moving into a square with each other in the second and the fifth houses. So that's where you might end up feeling some sort of tension. And
mm.
Laurie, what does that mean to you?
This one looks really simple in my mind for some reason. It's like Saturn's going into your second house, and Saturn going into the second house is okay, what's the reality of my financial situation? What do I need to learn about my financial situation? How do I need to kind of restrict and tighten up my finances? The second house is also about our own self-worth. So there's that piece as well. But if you just think about it as finances and then the conflict being with your fifth house, Jupiter going into your fifth house, wanting to expand your pleasures, wanting to expand how you have fun, how you give of yourself, possibly children or creativity. So there may be this real conflict between, oh, I've got this creative idea that I'm just ready to blow up this big creative project that I have in my mind, but it's going to cost me a lot of money. And I've got to be facing the reality of my financial situation. Or, it could be I just had a child and oh my God, I have all these things that I need to purchase, but Saturn just moved into my second house. So you can see how that conflict could be very clear.
Yeah.
Something between finances and pleasure, or finances and how you give of yourself.
Mhm. Or, maybe you're at the age where you have kids and they want to go to college. They would like to expand. I mean, your fifth house is children too. They're
Yeah.
ready to expand and grow. And, and you're like, oh my God, like college is so expensive these days, and trying to figure that out and trying to figure out how to be, take responsibility for those finances. But there's also the fifth house brings in generosity too. So it kind of draws out that there is a need to balance that. There's a need to balance austerity and generosity
Right.
here, and kind of saying, ooh, I better structure these. And, maybe it's time to, split things up differently, or, think about things in a different light, so that you can then go ahead and have some space for generosity,
Yeah.
that the fifth house brings to, and letting yourself enjoy the good things in life, or thinking, yeah, I really want educated children. I'd like them to go to college. How can I make that happen? Like, what are some resources that we can use?
Yeah.
So anyway, all right. Do you have anything else to add about that one?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty clear.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and stop sharing, and think we're completing this video at this point.
I think we're wrapping it up. So thank you, Jenny. And if anyone's still watching, thank you. Please leave us a message and all the stuff.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Lori.
Thanks, Jenny.